People may ask, why in 1997 should we hold a meeting on an event which took place 79 years ago? I think there's two important reasons for holding meetings like this, and for people learning about the events and the things described in it. The first is the German Revolution of 1918 to 1921 was the only direct experience we have of revolution in a more or less advanced industrial country. Germany in 1918 was not as advanced as Britain, or for that matter Germany is today, but nevertheless it's a country in which two-thirds of the population no longer worked on the land, worked in industry, which had all the characteristics of modern industrial state. Indeed, when the revolution took place, Germany was the world's second industrial power. And in connection with it, it's worth saying that for people who want to hear about the revolution, in English, there's very, very little information to be had. Even a quite useful book, like Eric Hobsbawm's Age of Extremes, only contains a couple of sentences on the German Revolution and effectively says it was no importance whatsoever. I want to argue it was of central importance to the history of the 20th century. Because if the German Revolution had succeeded, Hitler would not have come to power, we wouldn't have had Stalin, we wouldn't have had the experience of Stalinism, the whole history of the century would have been very different. It wouldn't be a century of Hiroshima and Auschwitz, it would have been a century of very, very different indeed. The second reason for it is the events of Germany of the German Revolution have relevance today. Before I came up here, one of the American comrades said to me, I came to this meeting because I didn't want to hear about Blair. Well, I may not use swear words in the course of the meeting, but the fact of the matter is the names Tony Blair and Tony Benn will be there by implication in the meeting. Now, let's start with the background. You see, usually, when you talk about revolution in Britain, people always say to you, Britain in, 1975, Britain in 1985, Britain in 1995, and no doubt I'd be saying it in Britain in the year 2000, isn't Russia in 1917. The implication being that a country that's had a long period of peaceful development, without mass clashes between the police and strikers, without armed workers, and so on and so forth, is a country which will never know revolution. Now, Germany, in 1910, 1911, 1912, 1913, was a country which had been through 30 or 40 years of peaceful development. There had been revolutionary upheavals, but they were back in 1848, 60 years before. There had been a period in which the Socialist Party was illegal, but that was back 25 years, in the 1880s. You had a society in which you had, although it was not a fully democratic society, enormous power was vested in the German Emperor, the Kaiser. The elections were not most elections weren't by universal male suffrage even. But nevertheless, it was a society in which it seemed you had a permanent government, which was what we'd call a Tory government, and a permanent opposition, which was Social Democrat, what we'd call a Labour opposition. The Labour opposition at one stage had called itself revolutionary. We used the works of Marx at its meetings and so on and so forth. But any perceptive commentator noted how peaceful the opposition itself had been. Such that one of the classic books on bureaucracy looks at the German Social Democratic Party in 1910 and says all movements in opposition become bureaucratised, become conservative, may use revolutionary language, are no longer revolutionary. It wasn't a society in which the level of strikes was lower than they have been in Britain in the last 25 years. And lower actually than they were in Britain at the same time in the early 1900s, the period 1910 to 1914. And it's a society in which people took it for granted, really. The opposition were working towards gradual reform in existing society, may use revolutionary language, but didn't mean it. And then when the war broke out in 1914, the Great First World War, opposition, the social democratic opposition, so used to working peacefully with the existing society, the war broke out, and almost with one exception, the Labour MPs voted for credits for the war. Quite incredible. Before, when there was no war, they voted against the war credits. The moment the war broke out, they voted for the war credits. They forgot all the speeches they'd made before about being for the unity of workers, for peacefulness, for negotiations, not war, solving international questions, and solidly backed the war effort. And even after the war got nastier as it went on, remember when the war broke out in August 1914, most people expected it to last 3 or 4 months. Like the last European war, the War of 1870 had lasted, 6 or 7 weeks. They expected the First World War to work no longer. As the war went on, it got nastier. Discontent began to grow against the war. There were strikes against the war. Some people split away from the German Social Democratic Party in opposition to the war. Nevertheless, there's a book, a book in English by an English observer of Germany, which I have at home, which was written in July 1918. And he says, basically, of course there have been these protests, this movement against the war in Germany. The movement against the war has got nowhere. German Social Democracy, the German Labour Party, is still in charge. There's going to be no revolution, no upheaval, and so forth. Then suddenly, the end of October, the beginning of November 1918, this suddenly changed. It changed to produce the most dramatic events, the events which we remember when we talk about the German Revolution. You suddenly had a situation where, literally, within a case of 7 days, the Prussian monarchy, which existed for 400 years, the German Empire, which had existed for 40 years, the German military, which had been ensconced for a couple of hundred years, they suddenly collapsed. And you had a situation developing within 7 days in which effective power right across the German Empire, and the German Empire was bigger than the United Germany is today, right across the German Empire was in the hands of workers' and soldiers' councils, in which the symbol of Germany was no longer the imperial eagle, it was the red flag, in which people began to see the possibility. Remember, Russia was already in the hands of workers and soldiers' councils, in which it seemed that the whole of Europe would soon be in the hands of the soldiers' councils. This produced a situation in which Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, wrote later, from one end of Europe to another, revolution seemed triumphant. Now, how did this come about and what happened to it? To understand how it came about, you have to understand really what produced the situation before 1914 that German workers seemed to be able to work within capitalism. It's this. Capitalism internationally went through a period of 30 or 40 years of expansion. Countries that have been very unindustrialized, like Germany, began to become industrialized, began to catch up with the existing advanced capitalist country, Britain, and then the United States. That process, the process of growth of capitalism, created the possibility for a period. Production was increasing, output was increasing, profits could rise, and so could workers' living standards at the same time. And therefore, you had a working class which came to take for granted things which its parents and grandparents hadn't been able to take for granted. Better livelihood, better living standards, better clothing, slightly better housing, and so on and so forth. The difficulty was that capitalism, a point was reached by 1908, 1910, in which the growth of German capitalism suddenly confronted the power of the old British existing capitalisms. French capitalism, which had colonies amounted to about a quarter of the world. British capitalism, which had an empire amounting to a third of the world. Little Belgium, which still had a huge colony in Africa. Holland, which controlled the huge area of Indonesia. The United States effectively colonized the whole of Central America, the Philippines and so forth. German capitalism had no room to move. The growth of German capitalism, the very things which had led to the working class being incorporated, accepting capitalism for 30 or 40 years, suddenly clashed with the reality around it. War broke out. When war broke out, everything which had gone positively for German workers previously suddenly turned into negative. It's rather like what happens when you have a boom under capitalism. Workers' living standards rise in a boom, then you have the slump, and suddenly certainty is replaced by uncertainty. Rising living standards by falling living standards. Security by insecurity. The war did this, but in a more condensed form. Crudely, workers who were used to getting up, go to work, go to the factory, and so on and so forth, half the working class, half the male workers were shunted off to the war. They were placed in the factories by female workers. And however good it is in general for women to work, in the conditions of the First World War, going to the factories meant the woman went to work, then had to get home, look after the kids, a double or treble burden based upon the women workers. Not only that, in order to pay for the war, to produce the shells and the munitions of the war, the working day was extended. Trade union rights were whittled down. Usually with the support of the trade union leaders, but effectively workers were under military discipline in the factories. And then living standards began to collapse. Germany was blockaded by British and French ships, and therefore the food supplies began to die down. I mean, in the winter, I think 1916, the winter of 1916, 1917, became known as the turnip winter. Because there were no potatoes, there were turnips. There was no coffee, there was ground up turnips. It seemed that everything you ate was turnips. A complete deterioration in living standards. Faced with this, at the same time, all the old class aspects of society remained there. The rich remained untouched by the general deprivation. In the armed forces, when the war broke out in 1914, many working class people were genuinely enthusiastic for the war. It seemed to break with the routine. The idea of, if you lived in some godforsaken town in the Ruhr, the idea that you're going to be in Paris by Christmas, the Folie Bergère and all this sort of stuff, appealed to people. Once you were stuck in the mud of Flanders, and you knew that your officers were eating beautiful food, drinking champagne and so on and so forth, and you knew this because you, ordinary rank-and-file soldiers, waited on them, the bitterness grew. And the bitterness grew throughout the war. But the war, like any great economic crisis, had a double effect. It increased the bitterness, but it led to immense disorganisation in terms of working class organisations. You couldn't have the whole trade unions had a difficult function with half the workers at the front. Opposition groups tried to organise against the war. Their leaders would be conscripted. So the one MP who opposed the war, Liebknecht, was imprisoned, then put in a punishment unit in the army, put in a situation where they hoped to get machine gunned down by the other side, at the front. It became more and more difficult for people to organise, and therefore there were no easy ways for people to express their opposition. And so what you had for 2 or 3 years of the war, it seemed that workers wouldn't fight back against the war. There'd be spasmodic outbreaks, food riots, protests, attempts at mutinies in the Navy. The mutineers thought they were going, would go on strike against what's been demanded of us. They went on strike. The military police came along, carted away the first 20 mutineers, executed them, and that smashed the mutiny. Even after a big wave of strikes in January 1918, it seemed that nothing would stop it. And then what brought the thing to a crunch? German imperialism found in the war it wasn't powerful enough to beat British, American, United States imperialism. It had one last attempt in the summer of 1918. And it's when this attempt took place that superficial commentators like this British author I wrote, could say, actually, the people have come to accept the war, they think they'll win the war, and so forth. By October 1918, it was clear German imperialism wasn't going to win the war. And with this situation, the German chief of staff, the German generals, decided somehow they had to get out of the war. And they did 2 things. Firstly, they handed over power to civilian government, including, for the first time in German history, a couple of Labour ministers. And the second thing they did was, they put under power this government and told this government to open up negotiations with the Allies. Quite important, because they didn't want to be seen themselves as responsible for starting the negotiations. The second thing they did, in order to strengthen their hands in the negotiations, they ordered the German fleet to sea. Now, the German fleet had been stuck in its harbours for 2 years because it was inferior to the British fleet. And it went to sea, almost certainly get it sunk. Their hope was some miracle. The German fleet would beat the British fleet on the high seas and they get better terms in negotiations. For the sailors in the German ports along the northwest coast of Germany, it was the incredible moment. Really, they'd suddenly been told, you're going to die, in the hope that these generals and these admirals have been living up, or even in privation for recent years, somehow will get away with it. They wouldn't do it. The sailors mutinied. Remembering the previous mutiny when their leaders had been executed, their initial mutiny, it seems, was mainly concerned, we've had enough. We aren't going to risk our lives. But to protect themselves, they had to march off the ships. They had to march around the towns. They had to disarm anyone who might take away their leaders and execute them. And so you find in the town of Kiel, the sailors stop the ships going to sea, march around the town, find local workers who for 4 years of the war, the deprivation, the queues, the privation and so forth, suddenly relate to what the soldiers are doing. Suddenly Kiel, the major naval base, is in the hands of armed sailors and workers. Naturally, without even thinking about it, they set up a Workers' and Sailors' Council to run the town. Having done that, they think, what are we going to do now? If we just stay in Kiel, they send sailors up from Hamburg and Bremen and Bremerhaven to deal with us. So they send delegations along the coast. Each place they come to, groups of sailors march around the ship, march around the ships, march around the barracks, march around the factories, call people out as a repetition of what's taking place in Kiel. In a couple of days, the whole of the naval fleet, all the dockyards, all the big marine installations, all the big naval cities are in the hands of armed workers, armed sailors, workers and soldiers. And everywhere they hoist the red flag, and everywhere the most amazing thing happens. The small groups of socialists, without any base, not understood, socialists would come out, make speeches and be elected in charge of the Soldiers' Workers' Councils. In Hamburg, a major industrial city, I don't know if the second or the third city of Germany at the time, a socialist journalist, a man called Paul Froelich, a man who wrote the biography of Rosa Luxemburg, which some of you may have read, gets a group of sailors, marches into the printing press, the big printing press of the Social Democratic paper, and turns out a paper supporting the revolution. Its front page begins, "Long live the German Revolution, long live socialism, long live world Bolshevism." And goes out and sells, this is what people got their cornflakes or on their breakfast tables the next day in Hamburg. And all the revolution spreads. It spreads almost without direction, spontaneously. Groups of sailors want to go home from the northwest coast to Munich, where they come from, to see their relatives. They've been stuck in these poxy, port towns for years. It's like being stuck in Portsmouth for 4 or 5 years. They want to get away from it. They want to get back to Munich with its nice wine, its beer, and so forth. They go on trains. They get up at Munich. 200 sailors. Munich, of course, is still controlled by a petty king, the King of Bavaria, part of the German Empire. All the older. They march around the town, going to the barracks. At each barrack, they call the soldiers out. A bohemian socialist, a man called Eisner in Munich, puts himself at the front of the delegation. The sailors say, "Oh, you're great." March to the Imperial Palace, throw out the Bavarian king, and put Eisner in as Prime Minister of Bavaria. That's how the revolution spreads. They say, how can this happen? Well, you have to say, all these frustrations built up during the war, the deprivations, the feeling that things couldn't change, which suddenly find a flashpoint. The flashpoint when the sailors' mutiny becomes the detonator for everything else which happens. And finally, the revolution reaches Berlin. And again, what happened in Berlin is like a rerun on a bigger scale of what's happened elsewhere. Groups of socialists call a strike. The biggest groups of socialists say, left-wing socialists say, "Oh, there's no feeling for a strike." So a few individuals duplicate leaflets, go to the factories. Nobody expects it. And then the whole of Berlin, every factory is standing still. Workers march from the outskirts of Berlin to the centre, marching through the barracks. At each barracks, soldiers come out with their guns, tear off their lapels, their imperial lapels, and march towards the centre of the city. When they reach the centre of the city, 3 huge columns of workers march on the centre of the city. One of the anti-war socialists has been in prison, Karl Liebknecht, starts getting up on one of the big buildings and starts making a speech proclaiming the German Socialist Republic. In terror, one of the leaders of the majority socialists, Scheidemann, climbs up the Parliament building, sees Liebknecht is just down the road proclaiming the Socialist Republic. So Scheidemann rushes away. The story is he's eating his soup and he's told, "Look, Liebknecht's about to proclaim the Socialist Republic, do something." So Scheidemann goes up and says, "Long live the Republic." And he then goes back to his soup where he meets his mate Eber, who's the General Secretary of the German Social Democrat Party. Eber says, "How could you do this? You've broken all our principles." And Scheidemann basically says, "We didn't do this, we're finished." You have that feeling for the revolution taking place. Now, when you look at this, and then you actually find that once this has happened, all the old order of the king, all the old government, and so on and so forth collapses. But it doesn't mean automatically, people have very important to understand about any revolution. Revolutions are almost always characterised, if not always characterised, by a phenomenon called dual power. Dual power means this. The workers rise up and throw the symbols of the old order. They themselves begin to take power in the localities through workers' and soldiers' councils. But at the same time, workers don't cast off overnight all their years of deference, their years of looking upwards, and so on and so forth. Dual power means, on the one hand, at the local level, increased power falls into the hands of workers and soldiers' councils. It means at the centre of there's a vacuum which the old order is able to partially to fulfill. It happened in Germany like this. The workers overthrew the Kaiser. The majority Socialist Party opposed the move to overthrow the Kaiser. When the Kaiser was overthrown, the majority Socialists immediately rushed around forming a government, and formed a government which shared power with the workers and soldiers' councils. And you have a period, immediately after November 1918, in which you have this dual power, these two powers operating alongside each other in Germany. Summed up by the fact that, I think 2 days after the revolution, there's a huge meeting of workers and soldiers' councils in the centre of Berlin. It's called by the left. The majority socialists get up and say, "We've formed a government of this, that and the other. Majority socialists, some anti-war socialists together. We formed this government." And the mass of people in the crowd say, "Unity, unity, unity. We want a united government, a government of the old order and the new order combined." And then the majority socialists use this situation in order to try then to establish a new lever of power for themselves. Brought to power by the revolution which they oppose, they then get on the telephone to a man called Groener, the general in the Imperial General Staff, who says he speaks for Hindenburg. And I should explain to people, Hindenburg had been virtual military dictator in Germany for the last 2 years of the war. Hindenburg and Ludendorff together had virtually run Germany in the last 2 years of the war. Hindenburg was the man in 1933 handed power over to Hitler. In November and December 1918, the Social Democrats, the Tony Blairs, if you like, or the Dennis Healeys, for people who've got a bit of nostalgia for old Labour, we effectively were on the phone to the generals saying, let's work together to smash the revolution. And that's the period which followed. But the period of dual power was not just a straight period. I mean, people who imagine dual power, there's one power at the top, there's another power at the bottom. Whenever you have dual power, you have continual contradictions between them. And usually it takes the form, people at the bottom have power in the localities. The workers and soldiers' councils exist. And initially, the people in the workers and soldiers' councils accept that the majority, that the respectable opposition of the past should be in power. It's fairly logical. If you say to people, assume a revolution in Britain, you say to people, who have you heard of, Tony Benn or Tony Cliff? People say, Tony Benn, who's Tony Cliff? If you have a revolution in Britain tomorrow, there's no doubt Tony Benn will be in the revolutionary government, not Tony Cliff. Thousands upon thousands of people, all the people we imagine at Heathrow, all the people in the railways, the engineering factories and so on and so forth, they think of the person who's the best known oppositionist under the old order. In Germany, in November and December 1918, Ebert, we think of a respectable, but he's an oppositionist to the Kaiser for years. So Ebert should be in the government. Scheidemann, respectable, an oppositionist to the Kaiser for years, he should be in the government. Noska, respectable, but an oppositionist to the Kaiser for years, he should be in the government. Alongside them, some people slightly more radical in coloration. A man called Haas, a man called Lederbauer, a man called Barth. I could go through the names. But the majority of workers, you have to think, a revolution means people who never thought about politics before in their life get involved in political action. When they get involved in political action, they turn towards the people they think of as being radical. The sort of people who may make the odd radical comment on Question Time if it's in Britain today. They will be in a revolution, the first stage of the revolutionary government. Even though they don't believe in revolution, even though some of them will be working hand in glove with the old order to try and turn the revolution back. But of course the process doesn't stop there, because to turn the revolution back, the old order then had to begin from the first day of the revolution, to begin to claw back things which people gained from below. Workers' revolution proclaimed a shorter working week. The old order immediately began pushing for a longer working week. In the barracks, the soldiers tore up the epaulets, the imperial epaulets, wouldn't take orders from the officers unless they were countermanded by the soldiers' councils. And this is soldiers who look towards the Social Democrats. Immediately the generals want the soldiers under military discipline again, want to restore all the old order. And therefore you have a process going on for weeks and months in which this dual power begins to, the two sides of the dual power work together, but there's clashes between them, and the clashes between them, you get more and more radicalisation at the base of society. Now, the contradictions are expressed really, and I want to explain this, in terms of three trends inside the German working class. The first trend is majority Social Democrats. And here people shouldn't think, and it does relate to Tony Blair, people shouldn't believe that just because Tony Blair made lots of reactionary things, said lots of reactionary things before the election, all the people who voted for change on May the 1st saw through Tony Blair. In Germany in 1918, thousands, something like 80 or 90% of the German working class put their faith in the majority Social Democrats, not the opposition Social Democrats. After the 9th of November, they put their faith in the majority Social Democrats. The majority Social Democrats, in locality after locality, Workers' Council were formed. Who were the members of the Workers' Councils? The majority Social Democrats. A Workers' Council Congress took place in Berlin, I think it was the 16th of December 1918. This was the Workers' Council's there. It was there. It was the Constituent, effectively the Constituent Assembly, the assembly with power to determine the future of Germany. Who were there? We know the figures. 2/3 or 3/4 of the delegates were majority Social Democrats, who then voted to re-establish the old parliamentary system with the old state bureaucracy, everything there, not the Kaiser, but everything else as it was before. The second group that's important were the independent Social Democrats. Now these were people who accepted the general philosophy of the parliamentary road, of working with the existing system. Their leaders, I should say their leaders, I'll talk about their rank and file a bit later, who when the war broke out in 1914, couldn't give any thought to the idea, who rejected completely the slogan, turn the war into a civil war, or revolution against the war, whose notion was the war's an unpleasant thing, would last 3 months, you might as well vote for it, it'd soon be out the way, and then you could get back to peaceful things of the process. As the war went on, they began to dislike the war. They didn't like the militarism. At the same time, their answer was not, again, still not revolution. It was, let's have negotiations between the great powers. Let's have a peaceful settlement. Let's have summit conferences. Bring in the United Nations. All those sorts of solutions. But nevertheless, as the war went on, the war became more and more unpopular. The base of society began to express and articulate some of the resentments against the war among the more militant workers, among the more angry sailors, and so on and so forth, who had this contradictory attitude. On the one hand, they didn't like what capitalism was doing. On the other hand, they pulled back from a full-blooded revolutionary attack on capitalism. When the revolution broke, they had two contradictory lines. They said, oh, workers' councils are a good idea, but we should have parliament as well. So a man called Hilferding drew up a very elaborate programme for how you combine workers' councils with parliament, who said, oh, the majority Social Democrats are not very nice, but we can't get rid of them, so we have a joint government between the minority, between the opposition Social Democrats, they were called the Independent Social Democrats, and the majority Social Democrats. They were people who became known as the centre, because on the one hand you had the majority Social Democrats supporting the war, on the other hand, and I'll talk about them in a couple of minutes, the minority, a small minority of revolutionaries opposed to the war, and in the middle you had this block of people balancing between, not as far as the revolutionaries, not as far as the majority Social Democrats. Not with Tony Blair, not with the SWP. Any references to the previous meeting are completely accidental in this respect. The people who were known as centrists, who could articulate, some of them were sincere, some of them weren't, this is not the question, but they could articulate and expressed the great anger against the war, but were not prepared to push that anger in clear-blooded revolutionary direction. And the third people who emerged were the revolutionaries. The difficulty in the revolutionaries didn't really begin to organise till the war broke out. Under the most difficult circumstances, people being conscripted to the army, people being subject to military discipline in the factories. You couldn't put out open revolutionary leaflets. No provisions for underground agitation. Took 2 years, I think, for the first underground publications to begin to appear. Completely anonymous leaflets. So Rosa Luxemburg, who was the leading revolutionary, her most famous diatribe against the war, the Junior's brochure, no one knew who'd written it until, I think, 1917 or 1918, when Lenin, it was interesting, Lenin criticised it and he doesn't know who's written the publication. The result, the revolutionaries again begin to attract people, begin to attract individuals, find it very difficult to find their way into the main workplaces. And therefore the revolutionaries, when the revolution breaks, there was thought to be some 3,000 revolutionaries in Germany. Not people with roots in the factories, not people with any tradition of building a revolutionary organisation. Individuals are fantastically well known. Rosa Luxemburg, fantastically well known. Karl Liebknecht, incredibly well known. Clara Zetkin, former leader of the Social Democrat women's movement, incredibly well known. They were three individuals, not with any organisation on the ground, any roots on the ground, any way. Now, when you think 3,000 people, you know, anyone who's in Socialist Workers' Party, doesn't matter Socialist, not in the Socialist Workers' Party, when a big strike breaks out in your locality, you know, and even if there's 6 or 8 of you, and you go to the strike, you know you can't influence the strike unless you have people inside, on the stewards committee, known individuals who can argue with experience, who have weight with the workers around them. The revolutions of Germany didn't have anything like that. And therefore the revolution broke without there being any revolutionary leadership, and with the mass of people having these illusions in social democracy. The illusions of social democracy, I want to insist, are inevitable. Any great revolution in Britain, people will start looking to establish trade union leaders, shop stewards, local MPs, all sorts of figures. They won't start looking initially for the revolutionary left. But the revolutionary left in Germany, not only people not looking for it, the revolutionary left was not in much condition to intervene. The result was you had dual power, workers' councils in control of this huge chunk of Europe, controlling the second industrial power in the world, and yet within those workers' councils, the number of people who are clear, really, workers' councils versus parliament, workers' councils versus the old bureaucratic setup, either one or the other's got to give. Either workers' councils take power into their own hands, or the old generals will work with the Social Democrats to put power back into the hands of the old system. The number of people knowing that, very, very few indeed. Workers began to learn in their own experience. But they learned through a series of struggles which again and again led not to victory to workers, but led to defeats. And I'll try, and again, I had to skate through it, but really, it's an incredibly difficult period to tell, because really, from December 1918 to March 1919, a period of 14 or 15 months, there was a sort of civil war in slow motion right across Germany. In one city after another, the attempt of the old order to re-establish its control with a parliamentary facade led to workers' rebellion. In one city after another, the old order used its army, used its military means to shoot people down, to massacre people, to crush the rebellion. In the process, it made workers more radical, but also in the process it disarmed them and made it more difficult for them to struggle. It began in Berlin in January 1919. They said that after the revolution, the old police had been dissolved, and revolutionaries had established a police force to maintain law and order in the city under revolutionary control. This was one of the first things the generals and majority Social Democrats wanted to smash. They announced at the beginning of November, at the beginning of January 1919, they were getting rid of the old police. Workers were furious. A minority of workers were furious. Huge demonstrations took place of protests. The old order then used armed Social Democrat troops to disarm the police and to disarm those who protested, and then all the scum of the old Imperial Army, professional soldiers, the officers, the mercenaries, the equivalent of the SAS and the commando units, moved in and murdered workers, murdered revolutionaries in Berlin, including Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. Then they repeated the operation in Bremen. They moved in, started dissolving the power of the workers' councils. When people rose up, the Freikorps, this mercenary army of officers, commandos, SAS types, moved into Bremen. And then it was a question of, then it was a turn of an area which is called a turn of the Ruhr, where there was a fight for nationalisation of the mines. The workers began to take over the mines. The government, because it was putting down the revolution, putting down the dissidents in Bremen, pretended to negotiate for a fortnight. When it destroyed the movement in Bremen, it moved the army into the Ruhr. Then it was a question of an area called Central Germany. Moved the army into Central Germany, dissolving workers' councils, dissolving soldiers' councils, re-establishing military discipline. And then it was back again to Berlin, because in Berlin, such was the speed of the counter-revolution, destruction, that the very Social Democratic units, which had been prepared to disarm the revolutionaries in January, were themselves in revolt against what the majority Social Democratic government was doing with the generals in March. They moved into Berlin, and this time, facing the general strife in Berlin, a real massacre, a military occupation of Berlin. And then it goes on. Then it's a question then of Munich, where again you have Munich culminates in the establishment of a workers' republic in Bavaria, in Munich and the area around it, effectively for about 10 days. The workers' republic is then smashed militarily, and the leader of the workers' republic, Levine, is executed. Well, you have this process. Then it's again, end of December, it's back to Berlin, where a huge demonstration against dismantling of the workers' councils takes place, and the military opened fire on this huge demonstration outside the Berlin Parliament. It goes on and on and on. If you like, and you just have this whole phase of 14 months of civil war. The end of 14 months of civil war, even then, the rule of the bourgeoisie in Germany is precarious, because you have a situation where the bourgeoisie has re-established its monopoly of power. You have a social democratic government, but working alongside with the old generals, the old civil servants and so on and so forth. But at the same time, the working class has become incredibly radicalised. It's quite interesting. When people say workers never change, you just look at Germany. They had an election in January 1918, and it's interesting. The majority Social Democrats got, I think, 8 million votes. The opposition Social Democrats got 2 million votes. You know, the people who wanted some sort of idea of something more to the left than was being offered them were a small minority, one person in 17. Election by the summer of 1920, half the votes went to the parties to the left of the majority Social Democrats. In every centre of the German working class had learnt through experience to swing to the left. Or another story, when workers' councils set up in the Ruhr, one of the Ruhr towns, in November and December 1918, the people automatically elected their old trade union officials. Social Democrats were elected to lead the workers' councils. 6 weeks later, when they tried to hold the elections there, the parliamentary elections in this Ruhr town, in January the 16th, I think it's the 16th of January, 1919, they couldn't, workers stormed the ballot boxes and set fire to the ballot boxes. They wanted to take much more than was being offered. That was an extreme example, but that elements of radicalisation took place right across Germany. Whenever workers got the chance to re-elect workers' councils, they elected revolutionists to the workers' councils, not the majority Social Democrats. Yeah. But after 14 months, it seemed that Germany had been conquered. But even that wasn't the end of it, because the old order were working in collaboration with majority Social Democrats. Now, here we have to be clear. Majority Social Democrats are people who work for capitalism, who accept the capitalist system, but nevertheless their political base depends upon trying to provide certain concessions with workers. They're there because, really, the bourgeoisie never likes upstart working class people, even when they're trade union bureaucrats, general secretaries, MPs, and so forth. The bourgeoisie in Germany put up with them because they needed to control the working class. In March 1920, a section of the bourgeoisie decided the Social Democrats had done enough. And they decided, the Social Democrats have ruled with the help of the military bayonets, now we'll get rid of the Social Democrats. They proclaimed a coup d'etat in Berlin, announced a man called Kapp was forming a military government, and that's the end of the Social Democrats. Most amazing response. One of the worst Social Democrat trade union leaders, someone who really, I'm trying to think of someone who makes Johnson of the Postal Workers Union, and certainly makes Morris seem like a raving left-winger. One of the worst Social Democrat trade union leaders, called Le Guin, said, we're not putting up with it. I'm calling a general strike. Now, Le Guin himself, it didn't mean Le Guin himself organised a general strike, but what that meant down on the ground, all those people who supported the Social Democrats, all those workers, all those shop stewards who supported them, but began to worry about what was happening. Suddenly it was a case of, we've got to stop the right taking over completely. We've got to stop the military taking over completely. Everywhere where the proposition was put to them, the people to the left of the Social Democrats and the revolutionaries could go to the majority Social Democrat shop stewards and say, we want the general strike to work, let's get the general strike together. You had a general strike right across Germany as a result, in response to the Kapp Putsch. But more than this, it's a myth, which the general strike itself just ended the Kapp Putsch. It's a myth created in some of the history books. But more than that, in certain key areas, in the Ruhr, the centre of German capitalism, in some ways the Ruhr in 1990 was the centre of European capitalism. In the Ruhr, not only did you have a general strike, but revolutionaries, independent Social Democrats, working so often together, majority Social Democrats, set up workers' and soldiers' councils. They got arms from the barracks, took military control of the Ruhr region, established a Ruhr Red Army, which effectively drove the official German army out of the Ruhr. In the area around Chemnitz, near the Czech border, the revolutionary socialists formed a joint workers' council with the majority Social Democrats, the majority of the members were revolutionary socialists, and effectively established control of the Chemnitz area. In Berlin, the sheer scale of the general strike brought the whole of Berlin to paralyse the whole of Berlin. It became clear that the general strike was translated into an insurrection, and the insurrection wasn't just an insurrection against one government, it was against the whole idea that the workers should collaborate with the military to control Germany. In Terror, the Kapp regime resigned, and they brought back the old majority Social Democrat dependent upon bourgeois rule. It showed the potentiality for the revolution. If that's the case, why did the revolution fail? Now, I don't have time to go into all the later bits about the revolution, but I really want to go through it. And here, we really have to understand a couple of things. The first thing is that even after the Kapp Putsch, when you had this spreading movement, when it became clear the German workers had the power to take control of Germany, the majority Social Democrats continued to cling to the idea of alliance with the bourgeois officers. And so the Red Army, the German army had driven out of the Ruhr. Once the majority Social Democrats were back in office in Berlin, they then began to work on a basis of trying to get the German army back into the Ruhr, disarm the Red Army, and so on and so forth. And here, to understand how they got away with it, you have to look at the behaviour. The majority Social Democrats, the independent Social Democrats, and the revolutionaries. This description of what took place in the Kapp Putsch, description of what took place throughout the German Revolution. And here you have to say, first, the majority Social Democrats. They momentarily went under threat, really under threat from the officers, would make the odd radical call, but their whole commitment to working with the existing structure meant that they always tried to stabilise things. And once you try to stabilise things, you see the left-wing agitators, the people who try to form workers' and soldiers' councils, the people who talk about the arm of the working class, as the real enemy. So the Kapp Putsch takes place, Le Guin calls for the general strike. Once the majority Social Democrats are back in power, they then begin to operate again with the heads of the army. They kick out a few generals directly implicated in the Cat Putsch, and they work with the ones who didn't take one side or the other in the Cat Putsch. And they begin to think how they can get back into the Ruhr. And they say, what we have to do, we'll offer peace terms to the Workers' Council in the Ruhr, providing they accept the German armies in there. Once the German armies in there, then we'll start shooting people taking control. Effectively, they did. The second fault you have to look at throughout the German, and didn't happen once, it happened again and again in the course of the German Revolution. The second fault you have to look at are the independent Social Democrats. Independent Social Democrats who grew from being about a quarter or a fifth of the size of majority Social Democrats to being as big as them, both in terms of the number of members and in terms of their influence over the working class. These were people, let's remember, they were called the Centre. They didn't like the methods of majority Social Democrats, but they didn't like the methods of revolution. They wanted to conciliate, they somehow thought the way the majority of Social Democrats conciliated capitalism wasn't good enough. They wanted to go a bit further, but they didn't want to overthrow the whole apple cart. They half rejected the methods of the parliamentary road, but they were still committed to the parliamentary road. When it came to the question of... When it came to every decisive point in the German Revolution, they would half go along with workers who were rebelling against the majority Social Democrats, and then they'd turn around and say, oh, but we mustn't be so extreme, let's negotiate, let's come to a peaceful solution, let's have unity of the whole working class movement. And they'd carry on negotiations while the majority Social Democrats worked with the